Good evening. My name is Scott Dodson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. Welcome to our first of 5 Virginia Literary Awards events. Tonight's conversation features our nonfiction finalists, Chip Jones, Ryan Smith, and Nicole Myers-Turner, moderated by best-selling author and 2016 Library of Virginia Nonfiction Award winner, Kristin Green. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the generosity of our donors who make the library's work possible. Most notably this evening, Dominion Energy is the presenting sponsor of the 2021 Literary Awards. The Library of Virginia Foundation's work is to find the vital resources that help the library collect, preserve, and share the stories of Virginia. While the library is a state agency, much of its work, especially in the areas of education, historic preservation, and public programming, would not be possible without generous support from people like you. Tonight, I ask that you consider supporting the library's work by calling 804-692-3900 or visiting the link on your screen or in the comments. On behalf of all of us at the Library of Virginia, I thank you in advance for your support. And now to introduce our moderator this evening. Kristin Green is the author of Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County, published by HarperCollins in 2015 to critical acclaim. Kristin has worked for 2 decades as a reporter for newspapers, including the Boston Globe, the San Diego Union Tribune, and the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Her work has also appeared in The Atlantic. She holds a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School and is a graduate of the University of Mary Washington. She lives in Richmond, Virginia, with her husband and 2 daughters. And with that, Kristin, I turn it over to you and our nonfiction finalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me. And thanks everybody for being here tonight. We're so excited that you decided to join us for this great conversation. I was really thrilled to be asked to moderate this event and to have the opportunity to read these 3 fine books by our local authors. I'm just so excited to share with you their amazing research and the time that they put into writing these books, which are such a great contribution to literature in general, but to Virginia history. First, we have Chip Jones, a longtime reporter for Virginia papers, including the Roanoke Times and the Richmond Times-Dispatch. He got the idea for this book, The Oregon Thieves, working for the Richmond Academy of Medicine. Welcome, Mr. Jones.
Thanks, Kristin. You can call me Chip.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about this book?
Oh, sure. Well, thanks again, Scott and Kristin, and thanks to everyone who's taking time right now to tune in. I guess the first thing I wanted to say was that the Oregon Thieves, it could never have been written without the help and the insights of the people at the Library of Virginia, especially its really talented archivists and the rest of the staff, and its online portal. And if you have never gone to their online portal, I invite you to do it because I spent many months getting material there. During the 3 years that I spent researching the book, along with the help of my wife, Debbie, both of us marveled at the human and online resources at the Library of Virginia. And they gave us access to literally hundreds, if not thousands, of old newspaper articles and magazines and books and state government documents that couldn't be found anywhere else. I think the other overarching thing, Kristin, I'd just say about the focus of my work on this book is really how it shifted early on. And I think it really deepened as I personally learned, not a professional historian like the 2 esteemed other panelists, as a journalist, as a writer, as someone trying to write a popular history. I learned so much more about what had been billed until recently as a perfectly wonderful and important event in Virginia history. And that is the first heart transplant in the state at the Medical College of Virginia in 1968. Now, initially, I set out, as I oftentimes people wonder, how do you put together a book or get an idea for a book? And Kristin, you know as well as I do how that can shift. And it's early on, especially in discussions with editors and agents and other people. And initially, my thought process was to write kind of the Right Stuff version, Right Stuff by Richmond's own Tom Wolfe, and someone I'm sure you've read and I admired long ago. But the version of the heart transplant race. So like, the race to the moon, the race to the first heart transplant in the 1960s. Because there are a lot of things in Richmond and at MCV that powered that race. And so the more that I learned along the way in the early months of my interviews in 2016, 2017, including with former Governor Doug Wilder about his role in the later trial, the more I came to see that there was an added and really tragic element and dimension to the story. And that is a largely forgotten history of the poor treatment of the organ donor, a Black factory worker whose name was Bruce Tucker. And the many, many ways that systemic racism was rooted in MCV's origin story, and how this in turn contributed to the brutal and confusing events of May 1968. And so the question I pondered early on was how could this Black man's heart be removed without his prior authorization or even his family's knowledge that it was going to happen while he was in a coma? So following this line of inquiry, Kristin, this just took me in a whole different direction than just a medical race story, and into a more challenging direction than when I first started. And it really opened my eyes personally, and I hope the book does, to the degree that it can open other eyes to the many, many disturbing and still really unresolved injustices facing Black Americans and other people of color right now, right in the 21st century.
I'm so glad you were open to that, to the question changing on your journey. Like, we're trained as reporters to keep changing, updating that question as we get information. So your book really became something. It sounds like your book became something you never envisioned it would be.
Exactly. I mean, it's a cliche to say this, but it was a journey, and it still is a journey. Mm-hmm. So I look forward to hearing from Ryan and Nicole, whom I just want to personally congratulate for their scholarship and their great books.
Great. Thank you so much, Chip. Mm-hmm. Next up, I want to introduce Dr. Ryan K. Smith. And he's a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, right here in Richmond. His book is Death and Rebirth in a Southern City, Richmond's Historic Cemeteries. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Hey, thank you, Kristin. Thanks for the welcome, and thanks for the invite to the Library of Virginia. I thank Scott and all the staff there, too, that helped put this together. It's great to see Chip, and I look forward to hearing from Nicole later as well. And just like Chip, I want to say just a few words about the Library of Virginia, too, for my project at the beginning. I could not have put this book together without the incredible resources there, and not only the collections, but just the staff who were able to show me some resources that I never would have found on my own and just have conversations with me. So it's a real tribute, I think, to the place, hearing what Chip has to say about it, and then certainly my own experience, too. And I know so many others who have done projects related to Virginia and Virginia history. I am something of an academic, I suppose. I got a master's and a PhD in history, and I teach at Virginia Commonwealth University. But I was certainly thinking about the general public and public history and public sites when I was starting on my particular project here. I was trained to study the historic landscape and to view architecture and art and material culture as just as important sources to understand the past as the written documents and the written word and other types of history. And so my book is really a study of cemeteries and the funerals or the deathways that surround them. And so specifically, it focuses on the history of those developments in Richmond, Virginia, throughout the whole course of the city's history. And I think about, Chip, what led you to write your book. I what led me to write this book was a little bit of a frustration that many of the most important cemeteries that have rich histories had not received a lot of historical attention. We didn't have full investigations of how they got started. And then also, even for those that we did have good histories of, they tended to be isolated histories, just of one site. And so I really wanted with my book to provide my students and myself, and hopefully the general public as well, a way to think about how these sites are all interconnected with one another. So it took me many, many years to do that kind of research in a variety of ways. And I think that what we learned is that the Richmond locale here is a really critical site for trying to tell the story of the history of burial practices in the South, or at least in the Commonwealth of Virginia over this amount of time. You know, our history goes back a really long time, obviously before the English colonization efforts, but then also with those colonization efforts, the history of slavery here, the history of the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Lost Cause, Jim Crow. The burial grounds in the city's history overall provide a real tremendous sweep through lens to which to view all of that. And so as a non-native Richmonder, it provided a way for me to understand the city's history in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise, I think. And so I also thought it was critical in the book to understand the current state of preservation or lack thereof for the cemeteries. So I wasn't just interested in telling their origins and kind of the early life of these sites and how they related to one another, but also why certain sites look the way they do today, and who are the activists and preservationists and leaders who are trying to bring attention to a lot of sites that frankly had received a lot of mistreatment, had been erased, had been disregarded, or destroyed, frankly, in a lot of ways. So I wanted to tell that as full of a sweep as I could. I think there's a couple takeaways I'd suggest. One is we're used to thinking here in Richmond about memorial sites and monuments. And so the monumental landscape, I believe, has to include the cemeteries. It's not just what we see in Capitol Square or on the public avenues here and there or at the museums. It's these burial grounds, going back to the origins of the city, are really some of the most formative memorials in the city. And they continue to be. Just the element, the connection between the corpse and the dead body and human life, and what that has to say to us about individual legacies and individual worth and how we remember them today, is a really highly charged portion of the memorial landscape that I think deserved a lot of attention. A second takeaway I've already hinted at, which is that I wanted to show readers how these sites were interrelated with one another, not only in terms of time, how one model could turn into a different model and reflect on a previous model, but also how sites contemporary to one another had connections. So a lot of people, if they know anything about Richmond cemeteries, they think of Hollywood Cemetery. But I'm not sure we can understand Hollywood Cemetery without understanding the other cemeteries that were serving different populations of the city at that same time. These were interconnected stories, interconnected families, and the legacies of each site was directly related to each other. And then the last thing I suppose I'd want to take away from the book, without getting into the specific arguments, I do talk about a lot of change. We think of cemeteries as being pretty quiet places, right? At least the below ground population doesn't seem to make a lot of noise. But these are not sleepy locations. Anybody paying attention to the news over the last 10, 20 years, and certainly within the last year, has seen tremendous changes at these places. All kinds of activities, all kinds of recoveries, reclamation efforts, evolutions of interpretations of certain sites. And so what I hope readers of the book will see is just how oddly vibrant and creative and energetic these sites are, and what role they can play with all of that energy and all the changing that's going on around them towards a new sense of community in the city, or a new vision for how we can acknowledge the contributions of all of the city's residents over time, and not just those of a select few.
Fascinating. You really made me think about cemeteries in so many new ways. What a massive project to undertake. It was and I wouldn't have like thought about all the like different angles that you looked at. So I'm really fascinated by it. And I also love that you brought it up to the current day. Love that both of your books did that, because I don't know, I mean, they're both really relevant now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner. She's an assistant professor of religious studies at Yale University. Her book, Soul Liberty, The Evolution of Black Religious Politics in Post-Emancipation Virginia, explores Black religious political strategies. She taught at VCU before joining the faculty at Yale. It's good to have you back in Virginia, at least virtually, Dr. Turner.
It's lovely to be back, for sure. So I just want to say thank you. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Kristin, for moderating the panel. Thank you to my panelists for your work and the ways that your works are drawing attention to some of the issues around systemic inequality in the very fundamental aspects of life and medical care, in how we handle end-of-life issues. And a very special thank you to the Library of Virginia for this recognition, and also for the resource that the library has been. As my panelists have pointed out, the resources available at the Library of Virginia are tremendous. And it includes its staff. I remember when I started my research, it began as a dissertation, and I remember sitting down with Brent Tarter down in the dining area and getting oriented to the archive. And then also I had the just extreme pleasure of working with John Kneebone, who also worked at the Library of Virginia and is a tremendous historian, colleague, and scholar. And so just thank you for that. And then also just the records that reveal life aspects of religious life in terms of church records, but also the political life, which is where my work sits, at this intersection of religion and politics. So Soul Liberty is really an attempt to, I'll say, mess with a little bit our ideas about the intersection of religion and politics, with this idea of the always already politically engaged Black church. I have had a long-standing interest in Black religion and power, and wanted to understand how did Black churches become the political agents that we come to understand them to be. And Virginia's readjuster movement was a tremendous kind of historical problem and question in terms of the politics of the state, and one in which the landscape of Black religion actually plays an important role, but is often kind of understated. And so the study really kind of takes that question of sort of how could the readjuster movement mobilize Black and white, poor Black people and former Confederates into a political project, and explores how that came to be by looking at Black churches, which were actually really central. And so the project narrates how Black churches began when African-American people, and men in particular, did not have right to vote, but how they used their churches and associations as basically arguments for their capacity for political participation. And then they evolved, both in terms of the role of women. I think a lot of us tend to think about Black churches through the prism of the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr., which means that we're often thinking about institutional churches and Black men as key figures. But my study actually tries to historicize how is it that we come to this model of the sort of central Black male figure as a political agent. And then the project also looks at the very robust networks that Black churches built and how that informed their claims making in terms of politics. So this is where I start to look at the readjuster movement and understand that while yes, General William Mahone was a fascinating political figure, he was a tremendous political organizer, but he was also someone who was able to benefit from these very robust church networks that were established through the Baptist Convention, which I look at most closely, but they're also extant in the Reformed Zion Union Apostolic Church, which was a sort of even lesser known kind of holiness church down in the south side of Virginia. They had similar networks as well. And so the study brings us through this landscape to understand how John Mercer Langston, who was the first Black congressperson from Virginia elected, how he gets elected, both drawing on his own considerable resources as a wealthy free Black man, but also on these church networks that in large part drew on the labor of Black women to help sustain the political networks, but also the alliances and the relationships between the church members. And so the work, I hope, does a lot to bring to the fore this historical look at Black religion, its attempt to historicize Black churches so that we kind of move out of this framework of them always doing one thing all the time. But it also is an argument, because the work also has a digital component, an argument about the archive of Black religion. When I started the research, I was told that there wasn't a lot there, and that it would be a hard story to tell, for many reasons, and we could talk about later about the lack of resources. But I was also taught that one of the things that as historians, and particularly historians of African American life, one of the things that we have to do is to use everything we find. We don't always have the luxury of lots and lots and lots of anything in terms of written documentary sources. And so it really became a question of how do you use the archive to unearth the stories that are often paved over or lost, as is reflected in the work of my co-panelists. And so it really meant, how do I read the sources in the most rigorous, the most creative and inventive ways that I can? And one of the ways that I started to do that was thinking about mapping. And so the project also has a digital component that brings to fore maps that are based on these church convention minutes to illustrate a landscape that has often been paved over, but to sort of bring that to our sort of contemporary view and understanding. So those are some of the scope of the work, and I look forward to our discussion.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I want to stick with you for a minute. I just love the title of your book. The term soul liberty, so evocative. Can you explain what that term means, and how did Black men and women go about trying to achieve soul liberty after emancipation in Virginia? And I'm just wondering, what kind of groundwork had already been laid during slavery for them to sort of hit the ground running?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. Soul liberty. Soul liberty comes from the convention minutes, one of the Baptist Church convention minutes, where is actually one of the best examples of how it is that the churches and the members of these conventions were using these spaces to articulate themselves as citizens and as political people. They articulate that they are about the work of, sort of establishing soul liberty for themselves, and they call out to Roger Smith and saying, that just like Roger Smith is establishing Rhode Island, we are trying to establish our soul liberty here, which is the pursuit of righteousness, justice, freedom, and sort of political equity. And in so doing, they really are, sort of calling out for what it meant to become freed people after emancipation. And it incorporates both a spiritual freedom, a soul freedom, and also a soul freedom in terms of their ability as Black people to live. And in terms of the landscape of what had been established prior to emancipation, there were attempts to establish church conventions prior to emancipation. In fact, several of the Baptist conventions that were started in the Midwest in the early 1800s, 1830s, were abolitionist societies. So there were these attempts already to kind of organize as a community, but those networks became even broader after emancipation as newly freed people established their own churches, and then also went on to establish their own independent regional and state associations throughout the South. So there was a little bit of a landscape of this attempt to sort of mobilize together, but then that was expanded tremendously after emancipation.
How much did that predate the end of the Civil War? Just like a decade or more?
Oh, more than a decade. Yeah. So not remembering the exact dates of some of the early abolitionist church associations. That's at least the 1830s.
In Virginia?
In the Midwest. So they were in Ohio, where a lot of free Black people had gone to.
Yeah, a lot of from Virginia, huh?
There were, yeah, there were. And in fact, it was an interesting thing too, not to go on about this, but that there were a lot of Virginians, both in those abolition societies, but also in the attempts to build a National Baptist Association. So there were a lot of the same figures that we see in the post-emancipation period establishing the Virginia Baptist State Convention, who played a role in trying to establish a consolidated American Baptist Missionary Convention earlier, which did not succeed initially in the 1860s and 70s, but then by the 1890s, there is a National Baptist Convention that emerges.
So it sounds like you're saying that former Virginians, enslaved Virginians who either were set free or escaped enslavement, had resources, were able to put together churches in other states, and then came back after the Civil War to advance this more quickly than might have otherwise been possible because they had already laid the groundwork. Am I understanding that right?
Well, I think, yes, I think what happened is that there are these sort of antebellum associations that are networks of free and freed Black people. So who were able to establish these associations, and that provide some of the foundations for even some of the claims making that happens in the latter part of the after emancipation. But also that the folks who are in the associations who are themselves freed, like literally freed after 1865, also play a part in establishing these conventions and maintaining them.
It's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. I do just love the how evocative the title was. Chip, you talked about a little bit in your opening about how you didn't, like when you set out to do this project, you were more interested, or you're not that you were more interested, but that like your thought was that you were going to be like following this race to do who could conduct the first heart transplant, and then you realized at some point that the story was more complex. I'm curious how you navigated sort of what I see as the dueling themes of the race to be the first, and sort of the racism intrinsic to VCU's quote unquote success in being the first. How did you how did you thread both of those needles, as you put together this narrative?
Well, I'm going to not be facetious, but I'm just going to start by saying very carefully, because for one thing, I was fascinated what Nicole said about there being a lack of records. You'll see if you read my book, anyone listening, I faced a lack of records too. I faced a lack of a court record in 1972 when Doug Wilder defended or brought a lawsuit for the Tucker family. But I would say this, that, the kind of the writing terrain and the task before me as a former journalist and someone trained more in investigative journalism. And I think I shared this with you, Kristin, that sometimes the stories are sort of forgotten history and sort of things that are right under our nose. And I'll give you, for the listeners, I'll give and for the panelists too, a kind of an analogy. When I spent 5 years of doing nothing but covering the tobacco industry, and when Philip Morris was getting sued, and they were suing everyone back. And the guy they sued back for $10 billion was a guy named Walt Bogdanich, who worked for the Wall Street Journal and ABC. And that was around the time I got thrown into this on the local level. So there was a story there in the tobacco industry that it's like if you live here in Richards, like everyone knows that cigarettes are addictive. It reminds me sort of, I'm just going to throw something out for the co-panels. It reminds the language that I ran into with this book is the power of language. And as a former English major, I'm fascinated by that. People will say, of course, cigarettes are addictive. But then if you go downstream, it's like, or upstream, well, how did they become addictive? Well, the same way that people saying, of course we're not racist. It's like your book too, Kristin. It's sort of like there's these assumptions made in the narrative. And so I guess when I say that, what I'm trying to say about race is, because it's such a huge and such a fraught, topic, especially for, a white person trying to delve into a past I haven't experienced on that gut level. I wound up trying to explore the origin story there at MCV in a way with the help of Jody Costi, who's the archivist at the Virginia Commonwealth University. It used to be Tompkins McCall, and I see we have a question about renaming buildings, which I'm already going to deflect to Ryan because I know nothing about it. But anyway, that's just a warning, Ryan. But Jody and the incredible archives at VCU kind of opened my eyes to things that as a journalist, I didn't know about. I mean, as a non-scholar, I mean, just the whole history of grave robbing, the whole foundational story of, from Penn, which is the first medical school in 1765, and then on to Harvard. I'm not sure about Yale, but Columbia, they all were grounded initially in grave robbing, which is kind of an interesting, there's so many intersections between our work here. It's really interesting. And I learned a lot about not just race, but class, and why people could get their bodies stolen so easily, and then how that led to a lot of practices, including the insurance industry, which I didn't know that in the late 1800s, and people would buy policies so they wouldn't suffer that indignity of having their body taken. So what I was basically doing as a writer and as a journalist was learning on the job. As you know, Kristin, when you dive into something that may be a little bit deeper than you're supposed to go, I just kept going deeper as far as I could to try to connect the dots and threads as well as I could in a relatively short book. I hope that makes sense.
No, I thought it was like amazing. And I walked away, from my reading, a Black man, Bruce Tucker, was allowed to die or possibly worse so that his heart could be used. And I loved the introductory line. I forget who wrote it for you. It was so beautiful. Who wrote your intro?
Oh, Ben Jealous.
Oh, Ben Jealous, yes. And his opening line was, "They took a Black man's heart." Mm-hmm. And that is what I like when I walked away with after, reading the book. So anyway, I have more questions for you, but it's time for me to ask a question of Dr. Smith. And by the way, I was just pleasantly surprised at the overlap in your three books, like that both Chip and Dr. Smith's books explored the devaluation of the Black body, while Dr. Turner's book explores political empowerment of Black women and men after emancipation through the churches. I love that there were so many threads that kind of were overlapping between all of you, and that all three are so relevant today. Yeah. Dr. Smith, I was going to ask you, you find in the book that Black burial grounds were exploited by whites, which we all know, we just talked about that, and they became targets for grave robbing and destruction. And also you write that they were sites for development. When you set out to write this book, you talked about like this idea of a sort of a broad book. It almost sounded like a general book to me, where you would like just lay the like framework for all cemeteries in Richmond. But did you realize the extent of the role that racism played in the business of burial, and like what other egregious ways did it play out here that I haven't mentioned?
Sure. I knowing the history of the South and the history of Virginia and the role that slavery played here, I understood that racism was going to be a central part of the story. But I guess what I didn't anticipate was seeing how it was able to evolve or remain a constant factor, even when lots of other changes were going on.
Oh, like, what do you mean?
The similar dynamics that, say, the burial ground for Negroes or the first African burial ground in Shockoe Bottom faced were some of the same structural issues that were being faced by Black Richmonders even after emancipation, during the Jim Crow era of lack of control over burial sites, having a municipality override property rights or override a designated burial spot, having the constant activity and agitation from the Black community to protest against those in very creative ways. But what seemed to happen was that the ball kept moving in a sense, so that the Black community was unable to remain fixated on one spot, because as burials had to move to another spot, then there had to be this new attempt to protect and maintain the second spot. And so then once that second spot would get threatened, and there would be perhaps a loss of control there because of the structures of racism, then the Black community would do the best it could to hold on to that. But once that battle was lost, it would have to move to the next. So what I didn't anticipate was how this is really a sequential story that takes place all the way up, into our current day. We're seeing it in the headlines of our newspapers in the Richmond region and far beyond, of Black burial grounds where we have acknowledged burials that are not treated in the same way that white burial grounds or majority burial ground sites are. And the same is true for Black remains that are held by institutions. There are museums and forensic collections, as we've seen in the headlines recently. And so this is a story that is just so profoundly woven into the history of death and memorialization in the city that I guess if you're asking for what struck me about it or what surprised me about it, was how on the surface things could change so dramatically. A cemetery design, a mentality about what was appropriate for death could change among the majority population, but there was never, it seemed like, a window that could open up to change that directory for devaluing Black burials. And
that's what I was gonna ask you, is like the devaluation of Black bodies throughout American history. This is just another way that it was carried out by our white supremacy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great quotes, sometimes in the blurbs of my book, and for plenty of other journalists too, who say the way we treat people in death reflects the way that we treat people in life. But sometimes that's not true. Sometimes on the books in the 1840s, there were laws that were passed, during the period of slavery. As Chip knows, there was laws against the grave robbing.
Yeah.
And it says that any grave that it would be disinterred and taken for these purposes, that was against the law. It didn't say any white grave, it said any grave. And sometimes those laws against, it's a fancy word, violation of sepulcher, were prompted by some of these grave robbing scandals that would hit the newspapers occasionally and cause people, and especially the Black community, to try to push back against that practice. But even though the law itself would suggest that there was at least an acknowledgement of Black humanity, or that they should receive some kind of treatment in death that might be different from treatment under the institution of slavery, they were never followed through. So it's a really...
That's a theme.
Yeah, that's a theme. Even in the 1880s, around Chris Baker and those very notorious grave robbing scandals, there were white newspapers that would profess sympathy with the families whose bodies were being violated in that way. And yet it still was not enough to really change the practice. Of course, the laws were passed that would allow for cadavers to be provided through convicts and other ways. So we think that the illegal grave robbing practice did taper off gradually. But even when white newspapers would say that the grave of a pauper should be just as sacrosanct as the grave of a leader, of a wealthy person, it still did not change practices, really. So you had a weird lip service, a weird ideology, some kind of a abstract recognition that something happens to the dead body that should be treated differently and with more respect than the live body. But it just never, up until the current struggles, right? The Black Lives Matter movement that we see engulfing our country today, it's still something that has to be fought for and has to be demanded and has to require effort to maintain.
So what percentage of, just roughly, of cemeteries in the Richmond region that you studied were Black or white? And I wanted to hear a little bit about the other burial grounds that you studied, because I know some of them are probably really fascinating, and we tend to really focus so much on Black and white here in Richmond that sometimes other communities are lost.
Yeah, great question. So maybe for me, one of the most interesting ones that we don't talk enough about, I think, here in Richmond or Virginia, are the national cemeteries. We all have heard of Arlington National Cemetery that was founded during and after the Civil War to the north of us. It's a national site of prominence that we're all familiar with. But at about the same time that was being set up, there were 5 different national cemeteries set up within the Richmond region, just outside the city, within 2 miles of the one-time Confederate capital. And so that was a really challenging site for a lot of reasons. It was used to rebury Union dead in a dignified setting that would valorize their sacrifices for the Union. And that was one of the few places where Black and white soldiers were buried with dignity side by side.
Wow.
There are members of the United States colored troops buried alongside regular white Army veterans there who had died. And so there was a moment, back to Nicole's history, that shows us in a variety of other ways how the history of the Black church and the position of Black women, might have gone a different way. It was a moment of contingency as these forces were coming together, and with the readjuster movement. And so I saw that too with the Richmond National Cemetery. There was a chance there to create a new model for a type of recognition and dignity across racial lines. But that moment doesn't really last, as the book chapter goes on to explain. But back to your original question, Kristin, about just the overall numbers, I think the overall population of Richmond provides us a useful place to look at when it comes to race relations over time, because the proportion of Black and white residents is generally stable. From the founding of the city in the 1730s to 1740s, it is roughly 50% of European descent and 50% of African descent, all the way into the 20th century. That percentage goes up and down generally, but if you had looked for prominent attention or publicity for the graveyards in town, you would be hearing about 20 or 30 years ago, St. John's Churchyard or Shockoe Hill, or maybe Hebrew Cemetery or Hollywood Cemetery, and some of the others that followed after that. And those are all predominantly white burial grounds. You would not have heard about the other half of that story, where half of the city's population had been buried. So there are literally 5 or 6 or 7 major African-American burial grounds, which, as I said at the beginning of the remarks, all of which have had to have real struggles and active campaigns to try to maintain their holds on the landscape.
Okay, I want to get back to you on that, but I have a question for Chip.
Yeah, well, I wanted to tag on something
Yeah, do it.
real quick, and then I answer your question. I thought it was so interesting what you were saying, and sadly interesting and tragic about the lack of respect and dignity of the cemeteries in general. And one of the things that came to my mind, and one of the learnings that I had in my research, was looking at, until fairly recent times, I mean, really into the 1960s and around 1970, the lack of respect over the treat. There was no federal kind of, I don't even know what the law was, but in the early 70s, basically, there was I think it was a medical, regulation was passed to try to respect bodies that were being dissected. And what really jumped out at me, it's like a parallel story to the lack of respect and legal enforcement at the graveyard level. The surgeons, and they were all white surgeons, and the ones I really studied a lot were at MCV. It was like frat boy behavior, It was the bro culture of the day, from all the way from before the Civil War, but well into the 60s. And they used, and it's shocking stuff and really kind of, gruesome. And I won't go into too much detail, but they would take those corpses and basically deface them and put cigars in their mouth. And that was part of the medical school practices well into, I'm going to say, the 50s, and sort of translated into the 60s. And I was fascinated personally by how much of that culture, how many of those traditions in the medical profession still, they might, and it's like signing those photos that they had when they were, you've probably seen them. I saw a whole book of photos and nothing but gross pictures of corpses on slabs, and that's what they did. I'm always reminded of this when I see, you know, the awful things that have happened. I won't name names locally at fraternities when people die. It's basically bodies were used for hazing, I guess is what I'm getting at. And it wasn't that long ago. And I think that, again, it's a parallel discussion about what we're talking about political power. But you know, these were, you know, and the things that were written about Chris Baker, who lived in the Egyptian building, and he lived till after my father was born in 1960. That's what blew my mind. This was like recent stuff.
Yeah.
All of these traditions underlie a lot of attitudes, okay? And the attitudes of some of the older doctors towards my book, in terms of calling people out on things that happen, I still hear it. I heard it, and I put it in the book about how they talk about Doug Wilder. Language. They call Doug Wilder, he was flamboyant. What does that mean? You know, there's all this dog whistling stuff that still goes on, and it goes on, and I won't go off on a political tangent, but all the discussions that are now about critical race theory, dog whistle, don't eat, you know. So
Well,
all three books are relevant in that way.
let me springboard off of that.
I'm sorry. Can I just add one thing there? I don't want to springboard, but just to underscore, though, that the persistence, the historical persistence of these systems of inequality, of the mistreatment of Black people, of denigrating sort of Black potential and political power. I mean, it was seen in the era of Reconstruction, certainly even in the ways that the Freedmen's Bureau dealt with Black churches and Black people. And I just think it underscores that this is not new. It's not just something from the 1960s or from 2020, but that this is the magnitude of what we're up against in this current moment, is to unearth the long history of the persistence of white supremacy and these historic inequalities.
Yep, exactly right. So did VCU, I mean, the court ruled for the defense, which was VCU. Bruce Tucker's family used Wilder to represent them to sue the hospital, and the jury found in favor of, I guess it's the medical institution, but or these particular doctors. What I'm getting at is, has there ever been any kind of apology? Has there ever been any payment made to the Tucker family? Have there ever been any sort of reparations? Have they done anything to publicly acknowledge what they did and make it right in any way?
Well, I've been asked that a lot, and I always start by saying, not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
I have personally asked the Board of Visitors and had some good discussions, and have had some back channel types of discussions, but there's never been a public apology. There's been no reparations. So that I'm aware of. I mean, you can always have private settlements, but if they exist, that's for future.
Well, the suit was dismissed, correct? So that would be unlikely, wouldn't it?
The jury ruled that the doctors were not guilty in terms of the allegations in the civil lawsuit, and obviously there was no payment, and so basically they walked out. His brother William walked out with nothing, and to this day there hasn't been any payment or hasn't been any official apology. No.
It's disgusting. I think it's time for that apology. Past time.
Could I say, Kristin, here? Yeah. The one thing I know that VCU has been doing along some of these themes is it has acknowledged the way that a different story, but related story, that's Chit refers to in the book as the East Marshall Street well, where the limb pit was found with at least 50 remains of individuals, primarily of African descent, that date from before 1860, that were used as anatomical specimens there. For a while, the university was not willing to follow up on that discovery or publicize it or try to think about the ultimate disposition of those remains or what obligations it might have to the community. But about 10 years ago, the university did begin an initiative called the East Marshall Street Well Project, where they have convened what they call a family representative council of folks from the descendant community who have been brought in to help advise the university as to what it can do to try to repair some of the damage that it has done in that particular story of those stolen cadavers. And so right now, we've been able to celebrate the return of those remains from the Smithsonian. They're currently being studied with help from MCV and their students at the Department of Historic Resources. And the Family Representative Council has recommended some memorialization and dignified reinterment of those remains. And so they have had some changes in the way that they educate the medical students in terms of some of these questions of ethics and history. But that story, as we know, dates really back to the 1850s or 60s from the literal dates of that well find. And so it has taken the university a long time to catch up to that story. And so I have not heard of anything to get closer to the Tucker story. And
I'll tag on that. In my book, I was fortunate to sit in on medical school class that Mark Ryan and several other professors taught, and they talked about historic trauma at that point. But I have never been publicly approached by anyone in a leadership position to say anything about Bruce Tucker. So I guess just speaking generally, it's shown me a lot about the dynamics of large institutions versus a person raising questions that might be disturbing.
I mean, it's systemic, just like Nicole was saying. It's hard for the system to apologize. I mean, they should, but to get there, it just seems like there's so much work to do. Okay, I'm getting depressed. I'm going to ask Nicole a question about something I consider very exciting, which is, there's so few stories of the amazing things that Black women have accomplished from this period, and you really bring to light, what I think is an unknown story. So tell me a little bit about the light you were able to shed on the true role of Black women in Black churches and religion for the period that you read about, because I think that's really exciting and something kind of different and new.
Thanks. And so, I think the study builds on the work of scholars like Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who situates for us the role that Black women played in the establishment of the National Baptist Convention, sort of leading in sort of forming what she calls a sort of gender consciousness that gives rise to a sort of a race-based consciousness that could lead to this national organization. And I found in her work, in the work of Anthea Butler and also Barclay Brown, that there is a good documentation of the ways that Black women play significant roles in Black churches. And I added to that conversation just a little bit more understanding. I would also add, to not mention Betty Collier Thomas also, who documents the role of Black women in churches and politics. But to add to that, just a discussion of how Black women become centered as figures who hold the purse strings. I mean, that's one of the primary ways that Black women are often pictured because they don't hold the sort of pulpit space, but they do hold significant roles as the financial people in the church, as the people who donate money. And so it was a really fascinating moment to uncover in the church convention minutes the recognition of the first woman's donation to a convention. She was a wife, Harriet Wells, the wife of Richard Wells, who was recognized in the convention for her gift of a gold coin, which they then went on to note in practically several of those subsequent conventions, her donation to the convention. So it was like the first moment that you see Black women sort of playing this financial role, and sort of the first time that they're actually even sort of referenced in the convention minutes. And then later you start to see women playing roles as leaders of the benevolent society. So the places that were, sort of key to helping the community to navigate financially. And so this is a really interesting and important, I think, moment to document, but it's also, I think, equally important to note how Black women in the churches were also subject to discipline in ways that men weren't, and that were inequitable in terms of gender dynamics, that Black women become these kind of figures that are sort of more talked about as objects in the sense of being the people who are supposed to be protected, but not necessarily actors in their own right. And I think this is something that what really shocked me was by the time I get to the end of the study and looking at William Mahone's kind of documentation of the folks that he gave appointments to, you can see that he gave appointments to white women, and he gave appointments to white men, and he gave appointments to Black men, but there were no Black women who were listed among those who were given appointments. And so it's a really interesting dynamic to see Black women so central in the religious spaces, but then also sort of excluded in the political landscape that they are so important in sustaining, right? So in John Mercer Langston's campaign, he's a shout out to the Langston Invincibles, like his organization of Black women who helped Black men go to the polls. And for those who were not literate enough to literally read the ballot, or you could say politically literate enough to read the ballot, they were helpmates in that space. And so it really is I would say a sort of undulating narrative of Black women's place in the churches. And the last thing I'll say is that it also, I hope, calls attention to the ways that gender roles are being established in Black church spaces. And so in the same way that I wanted to sort of think about this history of Black churches as changing across time, to also narrate that the current configuration of gender roles that we see in many churches is not one that is preordained, but rather one that comes into being as a result of choices, as a result of the historical contingency of the moment, of how people navigated a myriad of circumstances and situation of freedom. And so hopefully that's also a takeaway that people will get.
Do you think that Black women were left out because some of the social structures of the Black church were modeled on white churches? I had read that somewhere that they adopted morals that felt right to white Southern women, but didn't really fit for Black families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is a tension around some of the adoption of sort of these Victorian sort of models of family where Black formerly enslaved people after emancipation were encouraged, sometimes encouraged is maybe a too mild of a word, but encouraged to formalize their unions through marriage, when there was a variety of ways of people forming relationships of commitment and support to one another. But in order to obtain, government support, whether it be to obtain a pension from a husband who was a Civil War veteran or something like that, they had to sort of formalize their unions in order to be legible to the government. And so there's this kind of forcing of that framework on Black relationships at this time. But also, yes, I mean, these churches are sort of still carrying out some of the discipline meeting practices that were established in the antebellum period, and enforcing in those, rules around, and these were also just kind of moral rules around sexuality. So, dealing with people for issues of adultery or being pregnant out of wedlock. And so, and the whole notion of at least under slavery, sort of, charging a woman with being pregnant out of wedlock was really a pretty fraught proposition, given that, enslaved marriages were not formally recognized.
Right.
But I think in the post-emancipation moment, there is, this, the challenge of Black people trying to establish their humanity. I mean, we've been talking this evening about the lack of respect for Black people and for their bodies and for their lives. And so you have a whole population of people who have been enslaved and now are freed and are trying to establish themselves, both for themselves, but also in the larger society. And so I do believe that they had some sense of a need to present themselves as respectable human beings, and some of that is reflected in their handling of issues around sexuality and drinking and all those things. But I'll also just say that these are also I would say deeply held personal, religious, and moral beliefs that, in the holiness churches, people wanted to be sanctified for God. And literally that is their orientation, is to perform their lives and to behave in a way that would orient them in right relationship to God. And so I don't want to, sort of suggest that it's only a political mobilization or motivation for these sort of Victorian values. I think it's multifaceted.
What was the Black female like an easy scapegoat? I guess that's not a very sophisticated way to ask the question, but it was like she was the person who could be left out the easiest, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's more a question of, one of the churches that I look at, the Guildfield Baptist Church, where they handle some of these discipline meetings. It's not so much that the woman is the one who could be left out, but if you, as I read the developments in that church, when you have Black men who are for the first time being able to vote and hold political office, where they are sort of under hyper scrutiny in the same space and locale of Petersburg and Richmond, where they were still being harassed for literally being in the streets and made to produce passes when they were clearly freed, that there is a need to kind of navigate this landscape of appearing respectable. And so it's a lot easier to, sort of address a woman who, in the case of unwed pregnancy, is the one who's going to show most clearly the evidence of that act, to discipline her, but not to discipline the men.
Right.
And so I think this is a challenging part of that narrative, but is
patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, guys, we're getting towards the end here, so I'm going to give you each a little wrap-up question before we take some audience questions. So, Chip, I'm wondering, I'm trying to bring it to the current day. I mean, what we've been talking about is super relevant to today, but ending on a note that's kind of current. Can you talk about, the surgery you wrote about, like you said, wasn't that long ago. It was 1968 when a Black man's heart was taken, possibly from someone who could have lived. Well, that was my read anyway, if they hadn't wanted his heart. And it was implanted in somebody else without any family notice or permission. This was in many people who are still alive today's lifetime. So can you talk about just this one case that we know about? This is like a really egregious case that we happen to know about, right? What does this mean for the fundamental suspicion of the white-run medical system, and for questions, not just questions, but complaints from Black men and Black women in particular that they don't get good medical treatment, that they're not listened to, that their bodies are not valued as white bodies are?
So Sean Oatsey on his documentary, he did a lot of good interviews in Richmond, and he talked to me about it, shared with me about as I was trying to learn more about the environment locally, that's just those suspicions I've heard about in hundreds, scores of interviews and people that have called it around the country. The systemic racism, the fundamental things that we've been talking about. I think for me, even after my book came out, it just educated me, reinforced this notion of ongoing, just basically not trusting the establishment. And so, I guess my sort of ground truth place I came out on this as I've debated different people of different ages and different orientations and different physicians is, the truth is that Bruce Tucker probably would have died of his head injury. The truth also is that his family was never given a chance, getting back to what we've talked about, dignity and dying, never given a chance to say goodbye to him, to even know that he was in the hospital. And, early on, my first interview with Governor Wilder, that's what he kind of like underlined for me in early 2017, that it was an undertaker telling the family, did you know that your brother's heart's missing? And so are his kidneys. So it was, one can debate the clinical issues involved in this case. But actually, the truth is that medical ethicists, there's there's a book from Georgetown, Transplantation Ethics, that I got late in my research. But I was amazed that there's a whole chapter about the Tucker case. And they point, and a lot of modern day medical ethicists point out that the practices that were used to determine, quote, death, to define death, to use one EKG on EEG, the brainwave scan on him, and then to say that he was dead would never happen today, and shouldn't have happened then, because as Ryan said, there was the 1884 law that required a 24-hour waiting period, and that was just shun it aside. And so to me, what I got into in my story, because this is a story about surgeons, and this is a story about big egos, and this is a story about big institutions and how they operate. To me, it was a case where the people who were in charge were able to say, basically, we can ignore the law, just as you, Ryan, you were saying about ignoring the laws from the 1840s on. So that's how I connected it. Now, yeah. I know people can, and I'm happy to debate people about whether or not he was, Bruce Tucker, a black man with alcohol on his breath, was treated. I'm often asked by audiences, well, you think if he was white, he'd been treated differently? And I said, yeah, I really do. But there are a lot of people, even today, who don't feel that way, because they don't want to feel that way, because that would possibly, and I'm going to extrapolate here, that would call into question the attitudes of people that they cared about. Maybe Granddad Chip, who was a surgeon, maybe like people in Farmville that you knew when you wrote your book.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of similarities in these stories in terms of kind of a denial.
Yeah, failure to fix things.
Denial, and how much, even now, do large institutions want to embrace really, really uncomfortable truths?
Yeah, I mean, VCU could be a huge, does serve needy communities, but it could do so much more. And
they're working,
medical systems.
They're making active efforts. I mean, there's no question. I'm not questioning the people that are working hard to reach out to communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, et cetera, to get vaccinated. But this type of suspicion you're talking about is kind of underlies some of, at least, the historical trauma that exists.
Well, I mean, it's more than suspicion. We know that Black women die at much higher rates during childbirth, and that their children die at much higher rates, and that they feel like they aren't listened to, and they aren't listened to.
Exactly.
So anyway, Dr. Turner, I wanted to ask you a final question. We have a couple of questions that are kind of directed at Dr. Smith for wrapping up, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you think the relevance of your work is today. The story of the Black church is still a powerful force in politics. And I'm curious, like, what do you see as the future of, I don't want to go too general here and say the future of Black voters in America, but like, what role does the future of does the Black church have in our future? And I don't know, what do you think is interesting about where it sits today?
Thanks for that question. So, first, I would say that maybe we're understanding that there is a Black church as a representative of the experiences of African American people in religion, and there's also many Black churches, right? And so there are diverse approaches to faith and politics and power. And even extending the landscape of Black churches and Black religion to incorporate a greater consideration of the African traditional religions that continue to be practiced among African and African descended people is one way to think about the sort of future of Black religion. It's much broader than just Black Christianity. I think also one of the things that comes out pretty strongly, I think, from my work is how robust the networks were of those churches and how significant they were both for the community, even though then, perhaps even as now, a majority of folks were not members of churches, although they were church affiliated. And so to understand that that kind of network and power existed and continues to exist, I think is important, but also to note that those landscapes of Black religious networks are changing. And this has to do with the changing landscapes of predominantly Black communities and historical Black communities, to the point where we have sort of historical Black churches and the communities around them are shifting. So if we think about what's happening up near Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, right? A sort of pillar of the Black community, but Harlem is the community is changing because of gentrification. So we really have to think about kind of what is the landscape of politics and the political influence of Black churches going to be as the landscape of their communities shift. And then lastly, I think, in thinking about the role of Black women in politics and leadership, I think the study does, I worked in the study to unearth the ways that Black women's leadership has been submerged, but also just kind of a steady hum kind of backbone to Black political action. And I think we've seen the efficacy of these networks of Black women's organizing with, all of what we've seen happening in Georgia, both Stacey Abrams' activism and organizing and her roots in the church, as well as sort of thinking more broadly about her own aspirations, and then the ways that Black women have supported some of these more recent developments. So, I hope that the work helps illuminate all of these possibilities for the futures of Black churches and Black religion, that people are thoughtful about kind of what this current moment calls us to do.
Oh, thank you. Such important work, and I got so much out of it. Answered a lot of questions I had never asked, which I love. When it's like some really amazing direction. So I hope readers will listeners will take time to sit with each of these books, because they're really so relevant, especially if you're living in Virginia. Dr. Smith, there was a couple of questions that I'm going to try to kind of combine with what my closing question for you was. And unless we get some other audience questions, this will be our sort of closing out our night together. Mm-hmm. So I followed a little bit the involvement of white group. I think they're mostly white groups that are taking over the care of several Black cemeteries in the Richmond region, with claims that they're going to preserve them. Can you kind of catch us up to date on this? I know Jill Lepore had a piece in the New Yorker that looked at this for a minute and sort of a bigger national picture that she did. But my understanding is there have been allegations of neglect, misuse of funds, and even locking out of Black groups or Black individuals from Black cemeteries. I wonder what you make of this, and I don't know, how can white allies help ensure that Black cemeteries are maintained? What can we do without causing more problems, without like getting, into a place where we're the ones who are, locking people out or not preventing like cemeteries from being maintained by Black descendants that want to maintain them?
So it's an excellent question. We've talked so much here about structural racism and white supremacy and the legacy of that on the landscape and on people's lives. But I do think that in the more recent efforts to reclaim some of these spaces, the story is a little bit more complicated. In the most recent wave of recovery efforts, some of the grassroots efforts were really inspiring, and they brought different groups from the community together in ways that I don't think that they had come together in preservation of these types of sites before. What I saw at those initial recovery days out at, say, Evergreen or East End Cemetery, which together make up almost 80 acres of historic African-American graves, was really inspiring. I saw people from all different faith denominations, newcomers to the area, people from outside of the area, old people, young people, and certainly white, Black, Latino, other immigrant groups coming together to all recognize that this is a Richmond story, an American story. It's not just an African-American story. And so I could point to somebody like John Shuck, who has been almost daily, if not weekly, for the past 10, 11, 12 years out doing really heroic work to try to connect descendants with sites that had been overgrown in a certain way. And so he was doing basic chopping through overgrowth and clearing out some trash, as well as the groups that popped up around him. And Marvin Harris is another really important leader to point to out of Evergreen, who was able to recruit plenty of white volunteers and others from the community. But what the question I think you're headed towards here is, we do see the reimposition of some structural challenges. When we look at what the state's solution to particularly East End and to Evergreen has been really disappointing. And I do hope that anybody who cares about this topic is paying close attention to what's happening out at Evergreen and East End cemeteries. Because the Enrichment Foundation, which is a Richmond City Parks organization that does have a white man as the executive director, has been basically given the resources by the state to take over ownership of the Evergreen Cemetery and the East End Cemetery, up to $500,000 of funds that essentially come from the state, as well as ongoing maintenance support from the state's laws that have been passed recently to help recover these Black graves. And yet his organization, the Enrichment Foundation, I do not think has been friendly to those longtime multiracial grassroots efforts. The Friends of East End Cemetery has been alienated from the site, exiled from the site, and Marvin Harris's earlier group has been locked out of the site, or at least chose to go to a different site out to Woodland Cemetery. And so what I see there is a really disappointing pattern of lack of accountability for how this group was selected to receive those state funds, as well as some problems with their accounting for the expenditures that they're still receiving from the state. They have, I would suggest, handled poorly the discovery of human remains on site and posted them on social media. That seemed to be inappropriate to me. And as you point out, Kristin, here, there's lots of things I could talk about with some of our concerns out there. But since June, the cemeteries have been locked to outsiders. Descendants can get in if they make a certain phone call. And so there's been actually a descendant group, Descendants Council, that has formed by the African-American community that is trying to ask the governor and others to try to open up what has been a fairly opaque decision-making process and funding process for the Enrichment Foundation. And so that's been troubling and a turn of events that I did not anticipate as I was reaching the end of this book, when we saw the transition of this site into what might have been a better future for these historic graves. And so maybe I would end on a more positive note and say that I think that this kind of work can be done in the current age, has been done. There are a lot of very exciting reclamation efforts. I look at Woodland Cemetery, founded recently by the Woodland Restoration Foundation, which has brought ownership out there. This is where Arthur Ashe is buried. Oh. It's about a 30-acre site that even when I was finishing writing the book, still had acres and acres of graves that were covered in brambles or trash or overgrowth. But they've been able to uncover a tremendous amount. And they've been working in what seems to me very positively with the county, Henrico County, and with a multiracial volunteer group, including the Friends of East End, who have moved their efforts out there. So it can be done, but I do think it takes the citizens who care about the future of these historic sites to ask questions and ask for public hearings and ask for the accountability that all these sites demand.
I mean, it is public money from what you're saying, that $500,000. So they should be way more accountable. I mean, we should be able to hold them accountable in that case. I do feel like the public attention on the cemeteries is an improvement to them just being, becoming junkyards. But sometimes allies have good intentions, but I don't know, get confused in how they execute, and doesn't always work to, they're not always, achieving what they set out to achieve.
I'm not a politician, I'm not even a policy guy. I'm a historian. I'm trained to look at patterns in the past and sources from the past. And so it's been, I guess, like with Chip has his own learning curve in terms of catching up to speed on some of the historical stuff, or on that particular field. I've had certainly my own learning curve on, what politicians' choices have been and why they make them and who supports which groups and why.
Yeah.
And
I just wonder if there's a little bit of a white savior thing going on that, prevents some groups from being as effective as others, but it's hard to single them out in this discussion. You have a couple of more, we need to end fairly quickly here, but one, yeah, go ahead.
Just mention really quickly, the Congress right now is considering adopting an African-American Graves Network Act, African-American Cemeteries Network Act, that would provide some federal oversight to at least collecting information on all these sites to help provide some kind of a model or coherent strategy towards their reclamation. And so that might be a useful way to start that could have a variety of voices and not the more closed process that we're working on.
Yeah, that's super exciting. So someone asked, I'm going to ask both of these in quick succession so you can answer them together, even though they're not totally related. One was, what about the bones that were left in the well? I'm not sure about that. Maybe you can explain that. And then the other question is, there are illegal Black cemeteries scattered around Richmond that not many people know about, or known to only a few, and how can they be preserved without risking that they'll be dug up and relocated?
Okay. Well, I'll take a quick stab, and I know that Chip can certainly weigh on this too, but at the East Marshall Street well, where the excavations to try to recover the remains that were found at the bottom of that well, that excavation only took place over the course of about 2 or 3 days. The archaeologists were given strict orders from the university administration that they had a limited amount of time to recover what they could, and then the construction of what would be the Contos building was going to proceed with or without any of those efforts. And so they were able to excavate, as I say, at least 50 individuals from there, but we know that they did not reach the bottom of that well and those remains. And so in essence, those were capped off and still remain underneath the Contos building, the foundations of the Contos building today. And to my knowledge, there's no efforts to somehow get down and recover them and excavate the remainder of them out. And so we have to treat the Contos building and that courtyard outside the Egyptian building as a sacred site, as a place where human remains are still below ground and not always fully recognized. There's some temporary signage up now inside the Contos building that I'm pleased with, but I think there needs to be better signage on the outside and a recognition that not all of those remains were recovered from that site. And as far as other sites that are under threat,
I think as part of the ongoing story, the whole story needs to be told. And as you said, Ryan, the archaeologists were starting to set up, it was an archaeological dig. And they weren't told that initially they only had 2 or 3 days. They were told that after a few days, and they were given a day before the backhoes started to operate again and basically threw mud and dirt over their site against their will. My point is, and I think it'll happen someday, I don't know when, that everyone who was involved in that decision making, that the whole story will be there. And as Ryan said, there's actually a whole other set of issues there around descendant communities that we don't have time to get into now about, whose story and whose bodies. But for the casual listener, those remains are literally within feet of the underground auditorium in the Contos. So new medical students have to be told about this, and there it is.
Okay. Sorry, you have to try to cut you off quickly. Maybe you could answer this question for us, Dr. Smith, about the cemeteries that are scattered around.
Yeah, we could point to a lot of them. There was some in the Granite community on the south side of Richmond that the proposed casino development was threatening to intrude upon.
Wow.
Up north in Hanover County, there's the Brown Grove community that is currently struggling against the Wegmans distribution center that is threatening to be built on the top of what appear to be a black burial ground there. There's innumerable other developments. The University of Richmond had a site that was recently recognized that had been built over there. So this is just an epidemic problem, again, pointing to the need for some kind of federal legislation along these lines. But maybe the most significant one that's currently under threat is the Shockoe Hill African Burying Ground, which was the successor to the original African burial ground in Shockoe Bottom. And so this is a site that opened up in 1816 and lasted until 1879 and would have held the remains of tens of thousands of Richmonders of African descent, both free and enslaved. Perhaps one of the largest. It ultimately spread up to what we think is just over 30 acres. And so it's a tremendously long-lived site and a large site that currently has zero signage, and people would not recognize it as a burial ground, unlike the Hebrew Cemetery or Shockoe Hills Cemetery next door to it. And right now there's high-speed rail developments and a widening of the I-64 interstate on its margins, as well as some other developments that might threaten to further intrude, kind of, even though we've now been able to document the history and the expansion of that site. There has been an uphill battle to get some of those infrastructure projects to recognize the nature of those grounds. And so it's a story that's worth paying attention to, because as we've all recognized tonight, this is an ongoing situation that everybody should care about.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, thank you so much for laying out that landscape for us, Ryan. And I just would add to it that it just seems to me that it really illuminates the need for more research on not just these inequitable practices, but literally the lives of Black people. I mean, so we live in a moment where, we've had a whole, sort of awakening or reawakening and reawakening around Black lives mattering. But I bet that some of those what are deemed now illegal cemeteries may be associated with former church communities. I know of instances where this has been the case, where there are cemeteries, and even sometimes the churches have lost sight of where their own burial grounds have been. And so I think, if anything, it's a great call for recentering the lives of Black people, recentering Black histories, so that we become aware of these sites that have been papered over and paved over and desecrated even through these actions. So thank you again for laying out that landscape and for making it even more clear to me the value of the history of African American people.
Thanks, Nicole. And we've seen around us just lately the JXN project in Jackson Ward of the Moon Sisters, the initiative that has put up some new signage to tell some of those individual stories of some of those pioneers from the Jackson Ward community. And even just on Sunday evening, I went over to the African Burial Ground, and the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality held a commemoration for Gabriel and told a lot of those kinds of stories. So there are, back to Nicole's point, there's some really creative ways to tell these stories that have been overlooked and to center them into our landscape and into our histories.
Guys, lots of fodder for your next books. I'm sure you already have them underway, but thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you for your beautiful books and for sharing your insights with us. It was such a joy and pleasure to talk with all three of you. Now I'm going to kick it back to Scott Dodson for our closing.
Thank you all again. It's been really fascinating to hear about all of your books. And just tremendous job tonight. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Kristin, as well, for really digging into all of these works. I know that moderating is always a challenge to make sure that everything lines up great. So thank you so much for doing that work. If anybody would like to support the library's work, please feel free to call 804-692-3900 or visit the link on your screen. Tomorrow evening will be night 2 of what is now Literary Awards week, with our fiction panel, with our finalists Rachel Beanland and Brian Castleberry, and moderated by author Brad Parks, who is also one of the Library Foundation's board members. So we're excited that he could do that tomorrow night. And then please don't forget to check out the rest of the week. And then again on Saturday night for the award celebration, where we'll announce the winners in each category at 6 p.m. with our host, Adriana Trigiani. So thanks to all of those that joined us tonight, those that are going to watch this video in the future. And everybody, please have a fantastic evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.